The dinner was supposed to be diplomatic. 20 world leaders gathered at the elegant state banquet in London. The elderly white servant poured water into President Obama's glass, hands trembling slightly from age. Obama looked up, smiled coldly, and spoke loud enough for every dignitary to hear clearly. "Tell me, old man, how does it feel serving a black president after all these decades?" The room fell completely silent. Silver forks stopped moving. Churchill, seated 3 chairs away, set down his expensive cigar very slowly. The servant's face turned crimson, but before he could respond, the legendary British Prime Minister rose from his chair with dignity. What did Churchill say that completely silenced Obama forever? "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The Lancaster house had seen many gatherings over its 2 centuries, but few carried the weight of this particular evening. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across mahogany tables set with fine china bearing the royal crest. 20 world leaders had assembled for what diplomatic circles called an intimate dinner for global cooperation. The kind of evening where treaties were whispered over wine and the fate of nations decided between courses. Winston Churchill arrived precisely on time, his walking stick tapping against marble floors worn smooth by centuries of important footsteps. At 91, he moved with deliberate care, but his mind remained sharp as winter steel. The Victoria Cross pinned to his lapel caught the light, a reminder of service that predated most of the men in this room. He had earned it not through politics, but through blood and sacrifice in conflicts these younger leaders had only read about in history books. The dining room hummed with controlled conversation. French President Macron discussed trade agreements with the German Chancellor while checking his phone. The Japanese Prime Minister examined the menu with diplomatic precision. President Putin sat alone, observing everyone with the patience of a chess master, and at the head table, President Obama worked the room with practiced charm, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. But Churchill's attention settled on a figure most would never notice. James Crawford moved between tables with the quiet efficiency of 40 years' experience. White hair combed neat, black uniform pressed to perfection, silver serving tray balanced in hands that had learned steadiness through decades of practice. Most guests looked through him as if he were furniture. Crawford preferred it that way. Invisibility was its own form of power. Churchill watched Crawford pour water, replace bread plates, adjust silverware with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed. The old Prime Minister remembered when service meant something different. When men served not because they had to, but because they understood honor lived in small actions performed with dignity. Crawford had started working Lancaster House in 1983, fresh from military service. He had requested this posting specifically. Quiet work, steady work, work that let a man disappear from the world's attention after seeing too much of it. The dining room had become his sanctuary, a place where protocol mattered more than politics and respect was measured in precision, not promises. The evening's guest list read like a roll call of global power. The Prime Ministers of Canada and Australia engaged in careful conversation about Pacific trade routes. The President of Brazil listened politely to economic theories from the head of the European Central Bank. Everyone spoke in measured tones, their words chosen with surgical care. These were people who understood that casual remarks could move markets and shift alliances. Churchill had attended thousands of such gatherings. He remembered when these dinners meant something beyond photo opportunities and carefully orchestrated statements, when leaders actually led instead of managing public opinion, when handshake agreements held more weight than signed treaties. The first course arrived without incident, roasted pheasant with seasonal vegetables, presented on plates that cost more than most people earned in a month. Crawford moved through the service with invisible grace, anticipating needs before they were voiced, a water glass refilled before it emptied, a dropped napkin replaced without request, the kind of seamless service that required both skill and genuine care. Obama dominated conversation at the head table, recounting stories from his presidency with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. His gestures were calculated, his laughter perfectly timed. Every word served a purpose, every pause designed for maximum effect. This was performance disguised as conversation. Churchill remembered a different kind of leadership, the kind forged in bomb shelters and emergency sessions, where words carried the weight of survival and decisions shaped the fate of civilizations, where leaders earned respect through sacrifice, not soundbites. Crawford paused at Churchill's table, refilling the old man's water glass with practiced care. For just a moment their eyes met. Churchill saw something familiar there, the quiet strength of a man who had served something larger than himself, who understood duty not as burden but as privilege. The evening's conversation turned to global challenges: climate change, economic inequality, regional conflicts that threatened stability. Each leader offered solutions with the certainty of someone who had never personally faced the consequences of failure. Their words carried the weight of theory, not experience. Churchill listened with the patience of age, remembering when such discussions happened in war rooms and emergency sessions, when failure meant not political embarrassment but actual death, when leaders understood that decisions had costs measured in blood, not polling numbers. Crawford continued his rounds, invisible to most but essential to all. He had mastered the art of being present without being noticed, of serving without servility. 40 years had taught him to read rooms like weather patterns. He could sense tension building, detect the moment when diplomatic courtesy would crack under pressure. Tonight felt different. The usual careful balance seemed fragile, as if something waited beneath the surface of polite conversation. Crawford had learned to trust such instincts. They had kept him alive during his military service and employed during 4 decades of civilian work. The Victoria Cross on Churchill's lapel carried memories of a different kind of service, earned in 1943 during the Italian campaign, when a young officer had pulled Churchill from a burning tank under enemy fire. The soldier had refused recognition then, claiming he was simply doing his job. Churchill had never forgotten that kind of quiet heroism. As dessert approached, the conversation grew more relaxed. Wine had loosened tongues slightly, though these were men and women too disciplined to lose complete control. Stories emerged from behind diplomatic masks. Moments of humanity glimpsed through carefully constructed personas. Crawford prepared for the final service of the evening, arranging clean glasses and fresh linens with mechanical precision. 4 decades of such evenings had taught him to anticipate every need, prevent every problem before it developed. He moved with the confidence of someone who understood his role completely. Obama's laughter rose above the general conversation, drawing attention to whatever story he was telling. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms filled with powerful people. Every gesture seemed calculated to reinforce his position as the most important person present. Churchill observed it all with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. He had learned to separate performance from substance, to recognize when power was being exercised for its own sake rather than for any meaningful purpose. The evening was approaching its climax, though none of the participants realized it yet. Crawford moved toward the head table, water pitcher in hand, ready to perform one final service before the evening concluded. His movements carried the same precision they had for 40 years, the same quiet dignity that had defined his approach to work and life. Churchill watched it all unfold with growing awareness that something significant was about to happen. He could feel it in the room's energy, see it in the subtle shifts of body language and conversation. His instincts, honed by decades of political and military experience, warned him that the evening's careful balance was about to be disturbed. The crystal pitcher in Crawford's hands caught the light as he approached Obama's chair, ready to perform a simple task that would somehow transform the entire evening. Neither man knew what was coming, but Churchill sensed it approaching like a storm on the horizon. Crawford approached the head table with the same quiet efficiency that had defined 40 years of service. The crystal pitcher felt familiar in his weathered hands, its weight as comfortable as breathing. Around the room, conversations continued in the measured tones of international diplomacy. Wine glasses caught candlelight, silverware clinked against fine china. The evening was proceeding exactly as protocol demanded. Obama sat back in his chair, golden eagle cufflinks catching the light as he gestured during another anecdote about American leadership. The cufflinks had been a gift from the Democratic National Committee, solid gold eagles with spread wings, symbols of power that Obama wore with conscious pride. They represented everything he had achieved, every barrier he had broken, every assumption he had shattered through sheer force of will and intelligence. Crawford moved to Obama's right side, preparing to refill the president's water glass. His movements carried no urgency, no particular attention to this moment over any other. This was simply part of the evening's rhythm, one small service among hundreds he would perform before the dinner concluded. Obama looked up as Crawford leaned forward. The president's eyes moved from the crystal pitcher to Crawford's lined face, taking in the white hair, the careful composure, the deferential posture of someone whose life had been spent in service to others. Something shifted in Obama's expression, a calculation, an opportunity. The words came out clearly, projected with the same authority Obama used when addressing Congress or foreign audiences. Every syllable was deliberately chosen and perfectly enunciated, designed to carry across the room and ensure that every world leader present could hear. "Tell me, old man, how does it feel serving a black president after all these decades?" The effect was immediate and devastating. Crawford's hand trembled almost imperceptibly. The crystal pitcher wavered for just a moment before training and discipline restored control. His face flushed deep red, but his expression remained carefully neutral. 4 decades of professional service had taught him to absorb insults and indignities without visible reaction. But this was different. This was public humiliation, witnessed by the most powerful people on earth. The French president's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Wine remained suspended in the German chancellor's glass. President Putin's eyes narrowed as he processed what he had just heard. The Japanese prime minister set down his napkin with deliberate care. 20 conversations died simultaneously, leaving only the sound of candle flames flickering and crystal glasses being placed on tables with unusual care. Obama leaned back in his chair, the golden eagle cufflinks catching light as he folded his hands. His smile carried satisfaction, the expression of someone who had just demonstrated his power in the most direct way possible. He had commanded the attention of every person in the room, reduced a career diplomat's evening to a teaching moment about race and progress in America. Churchill felt something cold settle in his chest. He had witnessed many demonstrations of power over 9 decades of life, but rarely had he seen cruelty disguised as social commentary. The old prime minister's fingers tightened around his walking stick, its carved handle worn smooth by years of use and the weight of difficult decisions. Crawford maintained his position, water pitcher still in hand, professional composure intact despite the heat burning in his cheeks. He had served prime ministers, presidents, and royalty. He had maintained dignity through decades of demanding work and difficult personalities. But this moment felt different. This was not about service or protocol. This was about being reduced to a symbol, a prop in someone else's demonstration of power. The Canadian Prime Minister shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The President of Brazil found sudden interest in his wine glass. Everyone understood they had just witnessed something that transcended normal diplomatic boundaries. This was not policy discussion or strategic negotiation. This was personal humiliation, delivered with calculated precision and witnessed by people who would carry the story to every capital in the world. Obama's expectation was clear in his expression. He anticipated approving nods, perhaps uncomfortable laughter that acknowledged the awkward truth of historical progress. He had challenged the room to confront racial dynamics they normally avoided discussing. In his mind, this was leadership. This was using power to force conversations that needed to happen. But the silence stretched beyond discomfort into something deeper. The weight of history pressed down on the elegant dining room. These walls had witnessed the planning of D-Day, the negotiation of peace treaties, the delicate diplomacy that prevented wars and saved lives. They had never witnessed such casual cruelty disguised as social progress. Churchill studied Obama's face, reading the satisfaction there. The president believed he had just delivered a profound lesson about power and progress. He had demonstrated that barriers had been broken, that the old order had changed, that traditional hierarchies no longer applied. In his mind, Crawford's humiliation was a small price to pay for such an important demonstration. Crawford finally spoke, his voice steady despite the tremor that threatened to break through his professional control. "I am honored to serve all guests equally, sir." The words carried 40 years of dignity, but also something else, a quiet rebuke wrapped in courtesy, professional pride that refused to be diminished by casual cruelty. Crawford had not simply absorbed the insult. He had transformed it into something that reflected his own character rather than his tormentor's intentions. Obama's smile faltered slightly. This was not the response he had anticipated. He had expected either silence or stammering, some visible demonstration of the psychological impact of his words. Instead, Crawford had maintained dignity while subtly challenging the entire premise of the question. Churchill felt something shift inside his chest. He had seen enough cruelty in his lifetime to recognize it in all its forms. This was not leadership or social progress. This was simply a powerful man exercising power because he could, using history and race as weapons against someone who had no ability to defend himself. The kitchen staff, visible through service doors, had frozen mid-task. They had heard Obama's words and witnessed Crawford's humiliation. These were people who understood service, who respected the dignity Crawford had maintained through 4 decades of professional excellence. Their faces showed shock, then anger, then something deeper. They were witnessing the destruction of everything they believed about honor in service. Churchill rose from his chair slowly, deliberately. The movement drew every eye in the room. At 91, his physical presence still commanded attention. The Victoria Cross on his lapel caught candlelight, a reminder of service earned through sacrifice rather than position. His walking stick supported him as he stood, but his voice would carry the weight of 9 decades of experience. The moment had arrived when someone would choose between diplomatic silence and moral courage, between protocol and human dignity, between the easy path of political calculation and the harder road of standing for something larger than personal advancement. Churchill's decision was already made. Churchill remained standing, his walking stick planted firmly on the marble floor. But instead of speaking immediately, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small leather notebook, the kind he had carried through decades of political battles and wartime decisions. With deliberate movements, he uncapped a fountain pen and began writing in the precise handwriting that had shaped history through countless memos and declarations. The scratching of pen against paper was audible in the stunned silence. Every eye in the room watched as Churchill wrote, his hand moving with the same careful precision he had used to draft wartime speeches and peace treaties. The note was brief, but its creation served a purpose beyond its content. It gave him time to think, to choose his words with the surgical precision that had defined his career. Crawford stood frozen beside Obama's chair, the crystal pitcher still balanced in his weathered hands. Training and instinct warred within him. Protocol demanded he continue his service, complete his rounds, maintain the invisible efficiency that had defined 40 years of professional life. But the sting of public humiliation made each breath feel like swallowing broken glass. He forced himself to move, stepping away from the head table with measured steps. The water in other glasses needed refreshing. The evening service could not stop because one guest had chosen cruelty over courtesy. Crawford had survived worse moments. Combat in his youth, the death of his wife 3 years earlier, budget cuts that had eliminated half his colleagues. He would survive this too. But dignity, once damaged in public, required more than survival to repair. The kitchen staff watched through service doors, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and barely contained anger. Margaret Wilson, head of catering, had worked with Crawford for 15 years. She had seen him maintain perfect composure during visits from difficult royalty, demanding diplomats and politicians whose arrogance exceeded their intelligence. But this felt different. This was personal attack disguised as social commentary. "Bastard," she whispered to her sous chef, the word carrying 40 years of accumulated respect for Crawford's professionalism. Around her, kitchen staff who had served world leaders without incident felt something crack inside their professional composure. They had witnessed not just an insult, but the deliberate destruction of everything they believed about dignity in service. Churchill finished his note and folded it carefully, placing it beside his plate. The simple act had given him time to process what he had witnessed and plan what came next. His mind moved through possibilities with the strategic thinking that had guided Britain through its darkest hours. This moment required more than emotional response. It demanded calculated precision. The memories came unbidden. Churchill remembered his own relationship with service, shaped by 9 decades of British tradition, but tempered by personal experience. He thought of Alfred, his valet during the war years, who had maintained Churchill's dignity during London's bombing raids. Alfred had pressed uniforms in bomb shelters, served tea during air raid alerts, maintain the small courtesies that preserve civilization during its greatest test. Alfred had never been reduced to a symbol or teaching tool. He had been respected as a man whose work contributed to something larger than himself. Churchill had learned early that true leadership recognized the dignity inherent in all honest work, regardless of its apparent importance or social status. Obama remained seated, his golden eagle cufflinks catching candlelight as he reached for his wine glass. His expression carried satisfaction, the look of someone who believed he had successfully demonstrated important truths about power and progress. In his mind, the evening had been elevated beyond mere diplomacy into something more significant. He had forced uncomfortable conversations that needed to happen. The president of Brazil shifted in his chair, exchanging glances with the German chancellor. Neither spoke, but their discomfort was visible. They had attended hundreds of diplomatic gatherings without witnessing such casual cruelty. The careful protocols that governed international relations suddenly seemed fragile, insufficient to address what they had just witnessed. Prime Minister Macron studied his wine with unusual intensity, while the Japanese Prime Minister found sudden interest in the evening's place cards. Everyone understood they had witnessed something that transcended normal diplomatic boundaries. This was not policy discussion or strategic negotiation. This was character being revealed under pressure. Putin watched it all with the calculating attention of someone who understood power and its exercise. He had seen leaders rise and fall based on moments like this, when true character emerged from behind carefully constructed public personas. His expression revealed nothing, but his attention remained fixed on Churchill, recognizing that something significant was developing. Churchill felt anger building beneath his calm exterior, but it was not the hot fury of youth. This was the controlled rage of someone who had seen too much suffering caused by casual cruelty. He had witnessed the consequences of leaders who exercised power without wisdom, who confused authority with permission to humiliate others. The British Prime Minister remembered other servants who had shaped his understanding of dignity and service. Thompson, the groundskeeper who had maintained Chartwell through decades of political storms. Mrs. Pearman, his secretary, who had typed classified documents during wartime, with complete discretion and unwavering professionalism. These were people who understood that honor resided in work performed with excellence, regardless of its social recognition. None of them had ever been reduced to props in someone else's demonstration of power. Crawford continued his rounds, refilling glasses with mechanical precision. His face had returned to its normal color, but something had changed in his movements. The easy confidence of 4 decades was replaced by careful control. He was performing his duties, but the joy had been extracted from the work. What had been service had become mere labor. Churchill observed this transformation with growing fury. He understood that Obama's words had accomplished exactly what they were intended to do. Reduce a man's life work to a racial teaching moment. Transform professional pride into personal humiliation. This was not leadership or social progress. This was simply cruelty dressed in progressive language. The handwritten note beside Churchill's plate contained 3 lines, written in the precise script that had shaped decades of important communications. True service requires recognition of dignity. Power exercised without wisdom becomes tyranny. Some lessons must be taught publicly. These words would guide what came next. Churchill had decided that this moment required more than diplomatic silence. Some behaviors could not be allowed to pass without response, regardless of their perpetrator's position or intentions. Obama's confidence remained unshaken. He had successfully commanded the room's attention, demonstrated his power over traditional hierarchies, and forced acknowledgement of historical progress. In his mind, Crawford's humiliation was a small price to pay for such an important lesson. The president expected the evening to continue with perhaps some uncomfortable discussion about race and progress, followed by the usual diplomatic platitudes about mutual understanding. He had no idea what was coming. The Canadian Prime Minister finally broke the silence, clearing his throat and attempting to redirect conversation toward safer topics. But his words felt hollow against the weight of what had just occurred. Normal diplomatic courtesy seemed inadequate to address the moral questions that now hung over the elegant dining room. Churchill remained standing, his walking stick supporting him, but his presence dominating the room through sheer force of accumulated authority. 9 decades of experience had taught him to recognize moments when silence became complicity, when diplomatic protocol needed to yield to moral imperative. The evening had reached a turning point. What happened next would be remembered long after the policy discussions and trade negotiations were forgotten. Churchill understood that some moments demanded courage over caution, character over calculation. The note lay folded beside his plate, containing the framework for what would follow. But first, he needed Crawford to understand that not everyone in the room viewed his humiliation as acceptable collateral damage in someone else's demonstration of progress. Churchill remained standing, his weight resting against the walking stick that had become as much a part of him as his own shadow. The cane's polished mahogany handle, worn smooth by decades of use, seemed to pulse with the weight of every decision it had supported. This was not merely a mobility aid, it was a repository of memory, a connection to 9 decades of service that had shaped the modern world. The silence in the room had evolved from shock into something heavier. What began as stunned reaction to Obama's words had deepened into a psychological standoff. 20 world leaders sat frozen in a moment that none of their diplomatic training had prepared them for. They were witnessing the collision of power and principle, played out between two men who represented fundamentally different understandings of leadership. Churchill felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. His mind moved through possibilities with the methodical precision that had guided Britain through its darkest hours. He could sit down, let the moment pass, preserve diplomatic harmony at the cost of moral clarity. The easy path would be to treat Obama's words as an unfortunate lapse in judgment, something to be overlooked in the interest of international cooperation. But some lines once crossed could not be uncrossed through silence. The walking stick bore witness to Churchill's internal struggle. His grip tightened around the handle as he weighed protocol against principle. Diplomatic training argued for restraint, for private words that preserved relationships while addressing concerns. Political calculation suggested that challenging a sitting American president would create complications that extended far beyond this dinner. But Churchill had learned long ago that leadership sometimes required choosing character over convenience. Obama's confidence was beginning to crack at the edges. He had expected his demonstration to spark discussion, perhaps uncomfortable but necessary conversation about progress and power. Instead, the silence stretched into something that felt increasingly like judgment. The room's energy had shifted from diplomatic courtesy to something colder, more calculating. The president reached for his wine glass, the golden eagle cufflinks catching candlelight in a way that now seemed ostentatious rather than elegant. His smile remained fixed, but uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. This was not how the evening was supposed to unfold. World leaders were supposed to engage with his challenge, acknowledge his point, perhaps debate its implications with the careful respect his position demanded. Crawford had finished his rounds but remained in the room, standing near the service station with the quiet dignity that had defined 40 years of professional life. His face showed no emotion, but something fundamental had changed in his posture. The easy confidence of someone who belonged in these spaces had been replaced by careful control. He was performing his duties, but the joy had been extracted from the work. Churchill observed this transformation with growing anger. He understood that Obama's words had accomplished exactly what they were intended to do: reduce a man's life work to a teaching moment, transform professional pride into personal humiliation. This was not leadership or social progress. This was simply power exercised without wisdom. The other world leaders exchanged glances that spoke volumes without requiring words. Prime Minister Macron studied his wine with unusual intensity, recognizing that normal diplomatic protocols were inadequate for what they were witnessing. The German Chancellor found sudden interest in the evening's program, avoiding eye contact with anyone at the head table. These were people accustomed to managing international crises, but none of their training had prepared them for this particular kind of moral complexity. President Putin watched it all with calculating attention, recognizing that this moment would define relationships and shape future negotiations. He had seen enough leaders rise and fall to understand that character revealed under pressure often mattered more than policy positions or strategic agreements. The silence was revealing everyone's true nature with surgical precision. Churchill's walking stick seemed to anchor him to something larger than the immediate moment. Through its polished surface he could feel the weight of every difficult decision he had ever made, every moment when leadership required choosing the harder path over the easier one. The cane had supported him through wartime cabinet meetings, where the fate of nations hung in balance. It had been with him during peace negotiations where careful words prevented future conflicts. Now it would support him through another kind of battle, one fought not with armies but with principles. The memories cascaded through Churchill's mind with vivid clarity. He remembered Alfred, his wartime valet, who had pressed uniforms in bomb shelters and served tea during air raids. Alfred had maintained dignity during London's darkest hours, understanding that small courtesies preserved civilization when everything else seemed to be crumbling. Churchill had never reduced Alfred to a symbol or teaching tool. He had been respected as a man whose work contributed to something larger than himself, whose professionalism helped maintain the standards that separated civilized society from chaos. The contrast with Crawford's treatment could not have been starker. Obama's expectation of approval was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. His demonstration of power had been met not with acknowledgement or debate, but with something approaching moral judgment. The room's energy felt hostile in a way he had not anticipated. These were supposed to be allies, partners in global cooperation who shared his progressive values and understood historical context. Instead, their silence felt like condemnation. Churchill understood that this moment would be remembered long after the evening's policy discussions were forgotten. Some incidents transcended their immediate context to become symbols of larger truths about character and leadership. The challenge was not just responding to Obama's words, but doing so in a way that honored the dignity Crawford deserved while teaching lessons about true leadership. The British Prime Minister felt the weight of representing more than just his own opinions. He carried the accumulated wisdom of British diplomatic tradition, the understanding that true leadership protected the vulnerable rather than exploiting them for political purposes. His response would reflect not just personal values but national character. The walking stick trembled slightly in Churchill's grip, not from physical weakness but from the intensity of suppressed emotion. He had witnessed enough cruelty in his lifetime to recognize it in all its forms. This was not social progress or necessary conversation about race and power. This was simply a demonstration of authority without wisdom, position without principle. Crawford maintained his position near the service station, his professional composure intact but something essential damaged. 40 years of dignified service had been reduced to a racial teaching moment in front of the most powerful people on earth. The humiliation was complete and public, witnessed by leaders who would carry the story to every capital in the world. Churchill could not allow this to stand unanswered. The decision crystallized with the clarity that had defined his greatest moments in leadership. Some battles had to be fought regardless of their political cost. Some principles required defense even when silence would be easier. Some moments demanded courage over calculation, character over convenience. The consequences would be significant. Challenging Obama publicly would create diplomatic complications that extended far beyond this evening. There would be phone calls from Downing Street, criticism from allies who valued stability over moral clarity, questions about Churchill's judgment and understanding of modern political realities. But Churchill had learned long ago that leadership sometimes required accepting short-term costs to defend long-term principles. Obama's discomfort was now visible to everyone in the room. His confidence was eroding under the weight of prolonged silence, replaced by uncertainty about how to regain control of a situation that had spun beyond his expectations. The demonstration that was supposed to showcase his understanding of power and progress had become something entirely different. Churchill lifted his walking stick slightly, testing its weight against the floor. The sound of wood against marble was audible in the profound silence, a small percussion note that somehow commanded attention. Every eye in the room focused on the elderly statesman, recognizing that something significant was about to unfold. The moment of decision had arrived. Churchill reached into his vest pocket with deliberate slowness, his fingers finding the worn leather wallet that had traveled with him through decades of political and personal battles. The room watched his every movement with the intensity of people who understood they were witnessing something significant unfold. The wallet itself was unremarkable, cracked leather darkened by age and use, but it contained something that would transform the entire evening. Obama's smile had frozen into something artificial as he watched Churchill's methodical movements. The president had expected either acquiescence or debate, not this calculated preparation for something larger. His golden eagle cufflinks caught candlelight as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the symbols of power feeling suddenly less substantial. Crawford remained near the service station, his professional composure intact, but his eyes reflecting confusion about why Churchill's attention had focused on him. 40 years of invisible service had taught him to blend into backgrounds, to perform essential functions without drawing notice. This level of attention felt foreign and somehow dangerous. Churchill withdrew a small photograph from his wallet's inner compartment, its edges worn soft by decades of handling. The black and white image had faded to sepia tones, but the details remained clear enough to tell a story that nobody in the room anticipated. He held it carefully, treating it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "Mr. Crawford," Churchill said, his voice carrying across the silent dining room with the authority of 9 decades. "Would you join me for a moment?" The request sent ripples of confusion through the assembled world leaders. Crawford hesitated, uncertain about protocol in this unprecedented situation. Being summoned by Churchill in front of such an audience violated every principle of invisible service that had guided his career. But Churchill's tone carried something that transcended normal diplomatic hierarchy. Crawford approached slowly, each step measured and careful. The room's attention focused on him with an intensity he had never experienced. These were people accustomed to commanding attention themselves, and their collective focus felt almost physical in its weight. Churchill extended the photograph toward Crawford, who accepted it with trembling hands. As recognition dawned on the servant's weathered features, his professional composure finally cracked. His eyes widened, then filled with memories that had been carefully stored away for decades. "Perhaps you could tell our distinguished guests about this photograph, Sergeant Crawford," Churchill said, emphasizing the military rank that nobody in the room had known Crawford possessed. Crawford stared at the image with growing amazement. It showed 2 young men in British military uniforms standing beside a damaged tank in what was clearly a combat zone. One was recognizable as a much younger Churchill, his face bearing the confident expression of a war correspondent who had seen too much. The other was Crawford himself, barely 20 years old, his uniform bearing the insignia of a combat engineer. "This was taken in Italy, sir," Crawford said quietly, his voice carrying a strength that had been absent since Obama's humiliation. "October 1943, after the tank engagement near Salerno." Churchill nodded, his expression grave with the weight of old memories. "Tell them what happened that day, Sergeant." The room had fallen into a silence so complete that the candle flames seemed loud in comparison. Every world leader leaned forward slightly, recognizing that they were about to hear something that would redefine their understanding of the evening's dynamics. Crawford's voice grew stronger as muscle memory of military bearing reasserted itself. "Lieutenant Churchill's reconnaissance vehicle hit a mine, sir. German position had us pinned down for 3 hours. When I reached the tank, it was starting to burn. Obama's face had drained of color as he began to understand the implications of what he was hearing. The man he had publicly humiliated for entertainment was not simply a career servant. Crawford was a decorated war veteran who had risked his life in service to something larger than himself. The Victoria Cross citation," Churchill continued, his voice carrying the formal weight of military recognition, "reads that Sergeant James Crawford, under heavy enemy fire, extracted wounded personnel from a burning armored vehicle, saving 3 lives at considerable personal risk." The photograph passed from hand to hand around the table as world leaders examined the evidence of Crawford's heroism. The young soldier in the image bore little resemblance to the elderly servant who had been serving their water, but the eyes remained the same, clear, steady, and carrying the quiet strength of someone who had faced death and chosen duty over safety. Prime Minister Macron studied the photograph with new understanding, recognizing that he had witnessed not just the humiliation of a servant, but the public degradation of a war hero. The German Chancellor's expression showed similar realization, while the Japanese Prime Minister set down his wineglass with unusual care. Putin's reaction was perhaps the most telling. A man who understood military service and its demands, he looked from the photograph to Crawford with visible respect, then toward Obama with something approaching contempt. Crawford stood straighter as he accepted the photograph back from Churchill. 40 years of invisible service had not erased his military bearing. It had simply been stored away beneath layers of professional courtesy. Now, reminded of who he had been before he became someone who poured water and arranged place settings, his true character reasserted itself. "I never spoke of this, sir," Crawford said to Churchill, his voice carrying the dignity that Obama's words had temporarily obscured. It seemed inappropriate. "Inappropriate?" Churchill's voice carried incredulous warmth. "Sergeant, you saved my life. I have carried this photograph for 80 years as a reminder that heroism often wears humble clothing." The revelation transformed everything about the evening's power dynamics. Obama's demonstration of authority over a servant had become the public humiliation of a war hero by someone whose greatest challenge had been political opposition. The contrast between Crawford's service and sacrifice and Obama's casual cruelty was stark enough to be almost unbearable. Crawford's surprise at being publicly honored after decades of anonymity was visible in his expression. He had spent 40 years believing that his military service was a closed chapter, relevant only to his own memories and sense of personal identity. To have it revealed and celebrated in such company felt surreal. The room's atmosphere had shifted completely. What began as diplomatic dinner had become a moral reckoning, with truth serving as the catalyst for transformation. Churchill's timing had been perfect, his revelation calculated to maximum effect. Churchill unfolded the handwritten note he had prepared earlier, his fingers smoothing the paper with the care of someone who understood the weight of words. The speech points written, his precise script, would guide what came next, but they were merely framework for truths that demanded expression. His voice, when it came, carried the authority of 9 decades spent distinguishing between leadership and mere position. "Mr. President," Churchill began, his words cutting through the silence with surgical precision, "you have just demonstrated the most profound misunderstanding of power I have witnessed in 50 years of international diplomacy." The accusation landed with devastating impact. Obama's golden eagle cufflinks caught candlelight as his hands tightened on the table edge. No sitting president had been addressed with such direct challenge in his memory, particularly not in front of assembled world leaders who would carry this moment to every capital on earth. Crawford stood transfixed, the photograph still trembling in his weathered hands. 40 years of invisible service had not prepared him for this kind of public defense. To be championed by Churchill, in front of the most powerful people on earth, felt like something from a dream he would never have dared to imagine. Churchill consulted his notes briefly before continuing. "True leadership is measured not by one's ability to humiliate the powerless, but by one's commitment to protecting the dignity of those who serve. Sergeant Crawford has demonstrated more genuine leadership in one afternoon of military service than some achieve in entire political careers." The words struck the room like physical blows. Prime Minister Macron found himself nodding involuntarily, recognizing truths about leadership that his own political training had somehow obscured. The German Chancellor set down her wineglass with new understanding of what she had just witnessed. Obama's face flushed as he struggled to regain control of a situation that had escaped his understanding completely. This was supposed to be his demonstration of progressive values and historical awareness. Instead, he found himself cast as the antagonist in a moral lesson about dignity and respect. "I was making a point about progress," Obama said, his voice carrying less authority than usual. "About how far we've come as a society." Churchill's expression showed no mercy. "Progress, Mr. President? You have just reduced a war hero to a teaching prop for your personal political narrative. You have taken a man who risked his life for freedom and treated him as a symbol for your own advancement. This is not progress. This is precisely the kind of casual cruelty that genuine leadership exists to prevent." Crawford felt something breaking inside his chest, but it was not pain. It was the release of 40 years of accumulated dignity that had been compressed into invisible service. To hear his sacrifice acknowledged, his character defended, his humanity recognized in such company felt like a resurrection of the soldier he had once been. The other world leaders were beginning to find their voices. President Macron cleared his throat and spoke with newfound conviction. "Monsieur Crawford, I want to personally thank you for your service. What we witnessed tonight was unacceptable." The German Chancellor nodded her agreement. "Herr Crawford, your dignity has been an example to us all this evening. The true example." Putin, who rarely spoke at such gatherings unless directly addressed, looked directly at Obama. "In Russia, we understand that a man's character is revealed not by how he treats his equals, but by how he treats those who cannot defend themselves." The room was transforming before Obama's eyes. What had begun as his demonstration of power was becoming his complete moral isolation. Every expression showed disapproval. Every glance carried judgment. These were supposed to be allies who shared his progressive values and understood historical context. Instead, they were teaching him lessons about basic human decency. Churchill returned to his notes, his voice gaining strength as he built toward his central point. Leadership, true leadership, recognizes that dignity belongs to every honest worker, regardless of their position or the color of their skin. What you have demonstrated tonight, Mr. President, is not progressive thinking but regressive behavior, the exercise of power without wisdom, authority without moral foundation. Crawford's eyes filled with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in decades. The recognition felt overwhelming after 40 years of invisible service. But more than personal vindication, he was witnessing something larger, the defense of principles that transcended individual recognition. Obama tried once more to regain control. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions." "Your intentions," Churchill replied with withering precision, "were to demonstrate your power by humiliating someone who could not defend himself. The road to moral failure is paved with such intentions." The Japanese Prime Minister, known for his diplomatic reserve, spoke with unusual directness. "Mr. Crawford, please accept our apologies for what you endured tonight. Your grace under such treatment has been exemplary." The shift was complete. Obama sat isolated in a room full of world leaders who had witnessed his character and found it wanting. The golden eagle cufflinks that had symbolized his authority now seemed like costume jewelry, meaningless ornaments worn by someone who had confused position with actual leadership. Churchill felt the familiar satisfaction of a battle fought for the right reasons. His speech notes had provided structure, but the passion came from something deeper, the understanding that some principles required defense regardless of diplomatic cost. Crawford straightened to his full height, military bearing reasserting itself after decades of service posture. The photograph in his hands was no longer just a memory, but evidence of a life spent in service to something larger than himself. The room waited for Churchill's final words, recognizing that this moment would be remembered long after the evening's policy discussions were forgotten. Churchill folded his speech notes with deliberate care and placed them beside the elegant dinner menu that had guided the evening's service. The irony was not lost on him that this menu, designed to commemorate an evening of international cooperation, would instead become a testament to something entirely different, a lesson about character delivered to the most powerful people on earth. "Mr. President," Churchill said, his voice carrying the accumulated authority of 9 decades, "you have provided us all with an invaluable education tonight. You have shown us the difference between holding power and possessing leadership, between commanding position and earning respect." Obama's golden eagle cufflinks caught candlelight as he struggled to maintain composure. The president, who had entered this room confident in his progressive credentials and moral authority, now found himself defending actions that appeared increasingly indefensible under scrutiny. Churchill's walking stick tapped once against the marble floor, the sound commanding absolute attention. "Sergeant Crawford saved my life when he was barely older than a boy. He did so not because I was important, but because it was right." That distinction between service motivated by humanity and service extracted through power is what separates true leadership from mere authority. Crawford stood motionless, the photograph still trembling in his weathered hands. To hear his life's work defended with such eloquence before such an audience felt like vindication 40 years in the making. The tears in his eyes reflected not just personal gratitude but recognition that something larger was being defended. The dinner menu lay before Churchill, its elegant script listing courses that now seemed trivial beside the moral feast being served. This would be a document worth preserving, not for its culinary details but as evidence of an evening when principles mattered more than politics. "Your question to Sergeant Crawford," Churchill continued, his voice gaining intensity, "revealed everything about your character and nothing about his. You saw a man serving water and thought you saw weakness. You witnessed dignity and mistook it for subservience. You encountered honor and confused it with opportunity." Obama tried to interrupt, but Churchill's raised hand silenced him with the authority of someone who had faced down Hitler and negotiated with Stalin. This was not a moment for explanations or justifications. This was a moment for truth. Leadership, Mr. President, is not about demonstrating your power over those who cannot resist. True leadership protects the dignity of those who serve, recognizes the valor in honest work, and understands that respect must be earned through character rather than demanded through position. Prime Minister Macron reached for the dinner menu, studying it as if seeing it for the first time. The evening's carefully planned courses seemed insignificant compared to the moral lesson being served. He understood that this document would be remembered long after the policy discussions were forgotten. The German Chancellor nodded toward Crawford with visible respect. Herr Crawford, your service to freedom deserves recognition, not ridicule. What happened tonight should never have occurred. Putin, who had remained largely silent throughout the dinner, spoke with cold precision. In my country, we have learned that those who humiliate heroes reveal only their own inadequacy. Churchill felt the moment building toward its inevitable conclusion. The room had transformed completely. What began as Obama's demonstration of progressive authority had become his complete moral isolation. Every face showed disapproval, every expression carried judgment. Sergeant Crawford, Churchill said, turning toward the elderly servant with visible warmth, you have served with distinction for 40 years. You have maintained dignity under circumstances that would have broken lesser men. Tonight, you have shown us all what true character looks like. Crawford straightened to his full height, military bearing fully restored after decades of service posture. Thank you, sir. It has been my honor to serve. The simple words carried more weight than any political speech delivered that evening. They reflected a life spent in service to something larger than personal ambition, work performed with excellence regardless of recognition or reward. Obama's isolation was now complete. The president, who had expected applause for his progressive demonstration, found himself surrounded by world leaders who had witnessed his character and found it wanting. His golden eagle cufflinks, symbols of American power, now seemed like hollow ornaments worn by someone who had confused authority with actual leadership. Churchill reached for the dinner menu, his fountain pen appearing as if by magic. With deliberate strokes, he signed his name across the bottom of the elegant card. I believe this evening deserves commemoration, he said, passing the menu toward Prime Minister Macron. One by one, world leaders signed the document that had become an artifact of moral education. Each signature represented not just attendance at a dinner, but witness to a lesson about dignity, respect, and true leadership. The menu transformed from elegant dinner program into historical document. Crawford watched in amazement as the most powerful people on earth signed their names to commemorate an evening when his dignity had been defended. 40 years of invisible service had culminated in this moment of public recognition, witnessed by leaders who would carry the story to every capital in the world. Obama sat frozen as the menu passed around him. His signature was notably absent from a document that would preserve the memory of his moral failure for posterity. The president, who had entered the evening confident in his progressive credentials, now faced the consequences of his casual cruelty. Churchill's final words carried the weight of absolute moral authority. True progress, Mr. President, is measured not by how far we have advanced beyond our past, but by how well we honor those who serve to make that advancement possible. Tonight you have shown us the difference between evolution and genuine progress. The room fell silent as the devastating truth of Churchill's words settled over the assembled leaders. The evening's lesson was complete, its moral delivered with surgical precision to an audience that would never forget what they had witnessed. The letter arrived on Churchill's desk, written in the careful script of someone who had learned penmanship, in an era when handwriting reflected character. The paper was simple, purchased from a corner shop near Crawford's modest flat, but the words it contained carried more weight than most diplomatic correspondence Churchill had received in decades. Dear Sir Winston, it began, I have served many distinguished guests over 40 years, but I have never been served as you served me Tuesday evening. Your defense of my honor has restored something I did not realize I had lost. Churchill set down the letter carefully, remembering the transformation he had witnessed in Crawford's bearing as the evening concluded. The elderly servant had walked taller when he left Lancaster House, military posture fully restored after decades of invisible service. The photograph of their wartime encounter, which Crawford had returned with reluctant gratitude, would remain in Churchill's wallet as a reminder that heroism often wore humble clothing. Obama had departed the dinner early, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching shame. The president, who had entered the evening expecting to demonstrate progressive leadership, had learned that true progress required more than political positions. It demanded moral courage and genuine respect for human dignity. The diplomatic community had been buzzing with accounts of the evening ever since. The signed dinner menu had become legendary, passed from embassy to embassy as evidence of a moment when principles mattered more than politics. World leaders who had witnessed Churchill's defense of Crawford spoke of it with the reverence reserved for historical moments that clarified fundamental truths about character and leadership. Crawford's letter continued with military precision. "You reminded me that service, whether in uniform or civilian clothes, carries dignity when performed with honor. I had forgotten that lesson until you chose to defend what I could not defend myself." Churchill folded the letter with the care he reserved for documents of genuine importance. Crawford's gratitude was meaningful, but the real victory lay in something larger: the preservation of principles that transcended individual recognition. Some battles had to be fought not for their political value but for their moral necessity. The impact on Crawford's daily work was immediately visible to those who knew him well. Margaret Wilson, head of catering, noticed the change in his posture, the return of quiet confidence that had somehow been eroded by years of invisible service. Crawford moved through Lancaster House with renewed pride, his work performed with the same excellence, but now accompanied by the knowledge that his dignity had been publicly defended by one of history's greatest leaders. The story spread through diplomatic circles with the persistence of genuine truth. In embassy receptions and international conferences, the tale of Churchill's defense of Crawford became a touchstone for discussions about leadership and respect. It reminded career diplomats and world leaders that their positions carried moral obligations beyond policy implementation and strategic calculation. Churchill reflected on the evening with satisfaction that had nothing to do with political victory. He had witnessed cruelty disguised as progress and chosen moral courage over diplomatic convenience. The decision to defend Crawford had cost nothing politically but gained something invaluable: the preservation of principles that defined civilized behavior. Crawford's letter concluded with simple dignity: "You have given an old soldier his honor back. I shall carry that gift for whatever years remain to me." The lesson of that evening would endure long after the participants had departed the stage of history. True leadership, as Churchill had demonstrated, was measured not by one's ability to exercise power over others, but by one's willingness to defend the dignity of those who could not defend themselves. In a world increasingly divided by politics and ideology, the story of Crawford and Churchill served as a reminder that respect for human dignity transcended all boundaries. Some truths, once spoken with moral authority, echoed through generations as testaments to what leadership could accomplish when guided by character rather than convenience.